We will go down the line and introduce folks, but yeah, so we have Tarek. Raise your hand, please. Thank you, sir. Tarek Myers, and Salome Tibabu, and Margot Jaffe, and Pedro Vidal. Wonderful. You don't know, you are in for a big treat. So I'm going to start off, and then we'll just have a great conversation. No pressure. Okay, great. So Tarek, you led D&I at Lyft and now at Coinbase. Talk to us about the difference in those two cultures and how it impacted mental health conversations. And I think you're sitting on a microphone.
Am I?
No, Margot.
Nope, I'm not. Well, first, good morning. Just want to take a moment to, it's been an interesting week and an interesting couple of weeks, but I wanted to just take a moment to recognize the life of Nigel Shelby of Alabama, who I had on my mind today when I was kind of walking in. So we can just take a couple of moments there. So the question was the difference in the culture and also kind of ways that mental health kind of actualizes, or the conversation on the lack thereof actualizes in those two places. So I think the reason why I have Nigel on my mind today is because, you know, Nigel didn't have the opportunity to actualize into who he was meant to be, right? And for folks who know my background, they know that I'm not a traditional D&I practitioner, came from the community affairs space, the nonprofit world, the policy world. But I got into the D&I space because, for me, Nigel's story wasn't unique, right? And that was heavy. And so what I committed myself to doing is when I was leaving the nonprofit world, I would join an organization and I would join a brand that was committed to enabling folks to actualize into who they were meant to be, right? That didn't just offer a brand promise of inclusion and of care and of self-care, right? But actually the promise matched the brand experience, which is something we've been talking about in the last week or so. So we'll start with Lyft. And I'll say that Lyft was such a very special place to me because as someone who grew up in the neighborhood that I did in Boston, I saw so many folks who struggled just by simply not having a ride to get from point A to point B, achieve some of the goals that they've wanted to do, right? So how am I gonna get to the grocery store because I live in a food desert? How am I gonna get to the train station and to get to work because I don't have a family car? Or in my case, how is I gonna get to school, right? Like with the mom who worked two jobs and a grandmother whose health was deteriorating. And so Lyft became a special place to me because it took so much care to try to empower the driver community who were so fatigued by some of these challenges that they were experiencing every day and had a way out, right? And for folks who haven't been, you know, or didn't necessarily come from working class experiences or some lower socioeconomic experiences, probably the folks who've benefited most from the Lyft platform, that wears on your soul, your spirit, and your mental health every day, right? And I grew up worrying about money and wealth and opportunity every day. And the moment that I didn't have to experience that was one less burden that I had to bear, right? And so for me, we took the mental health conversation really seriously at Lyft because while we had this promise of trying to alleviate some of this burden for our driver community, we had a lot of work to do so for our workforce who had very similar dreams. So what was it like for the black woman who came from Facebook to join an organization like Lyft, who had, you know, promises of inclusion at her previous employers and was just as angsty and just as nervous about whether or not she was going to experience the same level of discrimination or exclusion when she joined a community like Lyft? And what was our job to try to alleviate some of that burden? Or the caregiver who took some time off, right? And was really just hoping that when she or he jumped into the workforce again, that they were gonna have an opportunity to be accepted by their peers, and really just desired a promise from Lyft that when she or he joined the organization that they weren't going to experience the same amount of imposter syndrome that they've been experiencing over the last year or so. And what I found is it's actually the same conversation at Coinbase in a very different way. Same population, folks who have been deplatformed, left out of the financial crisis, left out of the financial institution, left out by the financial crisis, still looking for that same level of opportunity. So I would say that the communities are quite different, but the missions in my mind are very much the same, which is how can we remove some of the barriers to entry, right, that cause us to experience these ongoing and overwhelming amounts of fatigue over time. And so that's how we took the conversation pretty seriously, even before I feel like the conversation was normalized in the tech space.
Thank you, thank you. we'll be coming back to that, the normalizing the tech space. Margo, I want to move on to you. You work in accessibility and inclusion at Verizon Media, and you also are the leader of its Minds of All Kinds Neurodiversity, ERG. How has mental health been part of the conversation in both of those roles?
So my main role is with the accessibility team, and one of my colleagues is actually here, Denise. And our team focuses on making our products and services accessible for consumers with disabilities. So as a media company that reaches hundreds of millions of people around the world, we want to make sure everyone can access the content that we create and the apps and the websites that we build. So that's a little bit of an overview about my role. But where mental health comes in is really around the neurodiversity ERG, and my experience founding that 2 years ago. So to back up, 5 years ago today, actually, I'm celebrating an anniversary. 5 years ago today, I was diagnosed with ADHD and learned in that day that I had lived with it my whole life, but just had gone undiagnosed. And similar experience to Erin, my parents work in health, in the health field, and I had a privileged upbringing, and even then, never had any awareness that I had ADHD. So when I was diagnosed, I discovered there was a lack of relatable resources for women with ADHD, and that led to the creation of Kaleidoscope Society, which is a platform for women with ADHD. And even after accepting my diagnosis, creating a platform to empower other women with ADHD, when I came back into the corporate workplace about 3.5 years ago, I decided that wasn't a lens I was going to bring with me into work. I wasn't going to talk about that. And I just came in to do my job, which at the time was head of production within marketing. And because I was aware of the stigma and stereotypes that exist around that diagnosis. And so I was covering for basically a year, which was extremely taxing on my energy. And even as someone who was a vocal advocate in the community and somebody who had embraced my own experience, I experienced firsthand how difficult it can be to be the one, to be the first to talk about it at work when no one else is talking about mental health. And over time, I learned about our diversity and inclusion initiatives. I learned about ERGs. I never knew what an ERG was before. And I was like, oh, there's groups to support employees. We should start one around mental health and neurodiversity. And I mustered up the courage to talk to my manager about it and come out in the workplace because it wasn't really about me. It was just, I knew there was other people. And I knew that I was in a position of privilege within the organization, and I felt a responsibility to do what I could. And at the time, I didn't know anyone else that was who would care or who might want to be part of the group. But I just decided, you know what, I have faith that this is needed. And so about 2 years ago, got up on front of the whole company and shared my story. And then one by one, people started coming forward. And we built the Neurodiversity Employee Resource Group with a mission to empower all minds. And it's been a beautiful experience over the past 2 years with that group. And we've grown a global network of support with chapters around the world in 11 offices. We actually have our New York chapter leader here, Pam. And so we're building a network of support and also driving education and awareness within the company around mental health and around neurodiversity. So we support employees who have neurodivergent conditions such as ADHD, dyslexia, autism, OCD, depression, anxiety, just whatever's going on with their mind that they want resources, like we're there for them. And that also includes caretakers. So there's a lot of employees who are caretakers, whether it's like a child, loved one, partner. And more than half of people with caretaking responsibilities don't share that with their manager either. So that's another important group that we serve. So yeah, I think I answered your question. Mm-hmm. I have my little notes here, just in case.
You answer the question, and you get an A+ for using lenses in your answer. So, and part of what I loved hearing also is that when we do the lenses activity, the three most prominent red lenses that people share are politics, faith or spirituality, not bringing those to work, and then mental health. And the first mover of, as soon as someone shares the red lens that is mental health related, then other people share theirs, like, oh, I'm not alone. And so it's this relief that you don't have to, if you're covering someone else is probably covering the same lens, and so what that looks like. Solomé, as a high school student, you founded the nonprofit Anxiety in Teens to help others who are dealing with similar challenges as you. Since then, you've worked at a mental health startup and are now in venture capital at Launchpad Digital Health, while also co-authoring a monthly newsletter, which I'd like to get, by the way, on behavioral health and digital tech. So over that time, how have you seen mental health increasingly become a diversity and inclusion issue in and of itself?
Yeah, totally. And I'll speak mostly from my own personal experience. So anxiety in teens, as I was starting that, I was really living or just even evolving my awareness about the issue personally. So my parents, when they immigrated here, landed in Minnesota and went through great schools, was very social, and everything was going well, and then started developing debilitating OCD and panic attacks, social anxiety, and it was, I think Aaron had said earlier, something like a decade before OCD is diagnosed typically, and it was just, to my surprise, my parents, in neither of their languages, even had a vocabulary for obsessive compulsive disorder, and so just added that much more time to getting the help that I needed. And then later, also had my own startup focused on mental health tech because, of course, what's the best thing you can do for your mental health but to launch a startup, evidently. And got firsthand experience in trying different therapists and finding ones that could really understand my background and cultural competency and focus on OCD in particular. Definitely a lot of trial error on that front. And then later, working at a larger healthcare company in New York, this was really a period of time where I had managed my OCD and anxiety for several years, but for the first time in a decade, the OCD was coming back. And this was really challenging for me because the environment that I was in, very fast-paced, enterprise sales team, lots of challenges with the technologies and implementation and escalations, and I think Margot said earlier about just covering for all sorts of other things as it is. It was like pretty much my region, my territory's team was all white guys in New York, and then me from Minnesota. And so that in and of itself had my challenges with fitting in, and then here was this OCD unfolding for the first time in all these years. And so that was really hard for me because it was like I had managed it all these years, and even for somebody who was so well versed in mental health and anxiety and OCD, even I fell into this trap that this was a teenage phase, and I overcame it. And so on top of having to actually deal with the OCD, there was this piece of, oh, wow, this is really a chronic issue that I'm going to be managing, for the rest of my life. But what's really interesting is just the focus of the company, nothing against them, and this is pretty commonplace, I would think, for a lot of folks in this audience, if you're in healthcare or in a similar type of company, but the content of our work was human services, but actually navigating resources for employees internally was really challenging. Like, I did not feel comfortable seeking out the resources that we had, didn't even know where to start. You would think that would be a pretty innovative place to access those things, but I just didn't feel comfortable finding them or even using any of them. And so finally, the last point is now landing in the investing world, seeing all sorts of new solutions, especially in healthcare and more specifically mental health tech. Really excited about the space, but definitely have some pros and cons that we can talk about a little more later, but thinking more about how inclusive are these new tools and who are the types of people that are building them and for what audiences. I think we've got a long way to go still.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So we'll hear from Pedro. I have a question for you, and then we'll move into talking a bit about intersectionality and vulnerability, and then the product piece, where we see Lenza show up in product, and then have some Q&A, all very ambitious timing before lunch. So Pedro, as the Director of People Operations for the Burning Man Project, you oversee 120 full-time employees, 1,200 seasonal employees, and 10,000 volunteers who are considered staff. Talk to us about Burning Man's principle of radical inclusion and how that applies to mental health.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Burning Man, it's an event that happens in the middle of the desert. An entire city is built. Total 70,000 participants come together and really have an opportunity to be themselves. I attended Burning Man for the first time in 2009. And I actually went by myself. I knew absolutely no one. I was like, I'm going to check this Burning Man thing out and see what's it all about. And I really never felt more like myself ever in my life. I felt that I could just be who I was. I didn't need to apply any lens or any filter and just really show up. And I was very welcomed. Everybody that I met was incredibly warm, incredibly kind. And those values really stuck with me. So much so that when I came back, I've been working with Burning Man for about a year. I've been working in public health for the last 10 years prior to switching over. I really wanted to bring those values back to my work. And that is actually something that I've really seen through my involvement with the Burning Man community, is that so many people experience these values and they bring them back to their respective community, to their businesses, to their startups, to their new companies, and really try to distill those values in the outside world. But experiencing Burning Man as a participant is a little bit different than experiencing it as a staff member. And that is actually a challenge that we've realized and we've acknowledged and wanted to make sure that we incorporate much of the values that we experienced as burners, as participants, into our working. So with that, we've created opportunities for teams to have peer support services. For staff, we have different trainings on emotional intelligence and being able to give feedback and just being able to communicate in a manner that's more genuine and authentic. One thing that I've always felt and I've always led has been a personal mantra is, if we can't talk about the simple stuff, how can we talk about the difficult stuff? And I think that is something that is really worthwhile noting in so many of the challenges in talking about mental health or anything that can be taboo or that can be difficult. If we don't establish an initial point of connection with an individual, with a staff member, with a coworker, it's really difficult to transcend to even something more difficult. So that's something that I encourage in our manager trainings and our volunteer trainings to be able to do. But something that's also very interesting about our culture that is very decentralized. So with the 10,000 volunteers, I don't have a touch point with them on a day-to-day basis. And some of them are engaged with us year-round, and some of them are engaged just when they come to Black Rock City. So that's really reliant on each individual team to really maintain those connections and those relationships, and they do. We've had instances when staff members, burners, however we want to call them, have been in crisis, and this has been long after the event, and the entire network of people that are in this community get activated, and they start messaging on Facebook, sending emails, really connecting with one another and saying, hey, we have an individual that's in crisis and experiencing this. And this is all over the world, because people go to Black Rock City, which is in the middle of the desert, then they have to go back to their respective communities. And then we reach out to our networks together and say, hey, is anybody in Santa Cruz? Anybody has eyes on this individual? Last we heard from them was a couple days ago. We're really concerned. And so much of this, I think, is because people are able to be themselves, that they're even able to show what their vulnerabilities with one another. So I think it's just been a beautiful example of what happens when we can be authentic with one another, when we can just be ourselves. And I've just shared some of the challenging stuff, but equally there's so many beautiful things that come as a result of this. So much creativity, so much innovation, and so much compassion.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if this panel will come with me and turn up the heat a little bit. Because I'm trying to connect some dots from our morning panel and from what I heard from all of you in terms of, and I hope I don't get in trouble for this, hopefully this is okay, in terms of vulnerability, authenticity, who can take risks, who can show up, Oftentimes for leaders, for women and people of color and women of color to be more vulnerable, is you're actually seen as less capable, whereas if a straight white male stands up and shares a struggle that they're going through, they get props. Where do you, so in a lot of ways, mental health as kind of this frontier of D&I, because it cuts through all identities, right? It kind of touches on every population. Where do you see and how are you kind of wrestling with vulnerability, authenticity, coming out, and then also just the structural power that we're seeing in the workplaces and kind of who can do that? Does that make sense? Okay, so if you could just solve that in the next few minutes, that would be great. Thoughts on that?
Just real quick, I can say, at working various companies that weren't my startup, maybe I wasn't necessarily in a leadership role. Of course, I'm not a white male either and don't have that privilege, but one thing I do have is that I've been speaking out about my story for a long time and have built a great platform around it, and also have demonstrated that I'm a capable leader and have had a track record of both of those together of being successful with OCD, and I think making sure not to take granted of that. I think it's helped a lot and helped to colleagues talk more about mental health, and so maybe not necessarily being in a leadership position at somebody else's company, but certainly having that has helped. And so I guess now just starting somewhere, you have to start somewhere, but I'm glad I did a little earlier, so that it does help.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think to little piggyback on that, and also I think it's important to acknowledge a lot of companies have this desire of creating a greater sense of belonging. They really have a desire of creating more affinity with the organization. Coming from an organization that actually has it's the inverse. It was very much created by the very people, by the very same community. What I notice is that there isn't enough ownership of the fact that you're trying to create belonging. And what I mean by that is that in order for people to be engaged and to really be present and to be themselves, you have to be ready to welcome that. There have been times when I've said hello to people, and I'm not, or it's happened to me where it's like somebody says, "How are you doing?" But they're not that interested in knowing how I'm doing, right? It just becomes very colloquial, like, "Oh, how you doing?" And then they'll respond with, "How are you doing?" And I'm like, "Wait, I just asked you how you're doing." Like, there is this, they're not really that present to where they're able to actually respond. Or there are times when people have asked, "Do you really want to know how I'm doing?" And I'm like, "Yes, I'm interested in knowing how you're doing." So you have to be receptive to that. And a lot of times companies say, and managers want to feel that they are receptive to that, but they're not really willing to put in the emotional energy into that. And it requires a great deal of emotional energy and space and time for that. And I think that's where we miss that calculation in wanting to have a greater sense of belonging and acceptance and diversity, is that you also have to put the emotional work into that to be able to hold that kind of space. And I see that as a part of the problem, is that we're not really acknowledging and realizing the amount of output that it will require to be able to facilitate those types of conversations.
Thanks, and who that burden often falls on, and that unpaid labor and what that looks like too.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in high tech now. It's my second rodeo in hyper-growth environment, which has been a lot. I would say that, if I'm speaking truth to power, I think a lot of companies promise this idea of come to work, be yourself, you belong. All the Silicon Valley-isms that sound really good, that's supposed to be a value proposition to get you to come work for us and hit your 4-year vest. But the reality is that y'all don't want Tarek from Oakland, right? Like, you don't want me to bring all of Oakland to work every day. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that there's been, again, when we talk about brand promise and brand experience, I think that, folks want you to be as authentic as you can without making them feel uncomfortable, right? And I too have witnessed in now both iterations of my career several times where, those at the margins, so the poor and vulnerable, women, women of color, every intersectional identity, queer folks, trans folks, folks who are differently abled, folks who have never gone to school, folks who aren't in technical roles, just not have the space to be, to exist, right, as their true selves. And the reason why I think often this happens is because, when we talk about double consciousness, right, the way the world views us and how also we view ourselves, folks wonder if this is going to stop me from getting that promotion, right? Is this going to stop me from being seen as capable? Is this going to stop me from being an organizational insider because I have some political clout right now, and if I come out or uncover this identity or try to be my authentic self, how will this person perceive me? And I just think that, where I experienced this probably the most is one, around the time where we saw just an influx of Black Lives Matter protests, right? And then we saw following that an influx of anti-trans bathroom bills. And then on top of that, we experienced our recent election, right? And independent of your political affiliation, that was probably a quite divisive election. And what I saw were so many folks who came from all these different identities really trying to leave all that shit at home. And it was really difficult when they walked through the door to leave that at home. And for folks who may not have been impacted by those experiences or those events, there was never a willingness to kind of reach out and cross that line to say, hey, I don't know what it's like to be a brother right now, or a sister right now, given the fact that we've just saw these, several state-sanctioned deaths occur in our communities, but I'm here for you. Or I don't know how to be there for you, right? But I want to understand. And there just seems to be this lack of willingness to cross the line, and yet folks want their employees to experience this high sense of belonging because it drives engagement. And then with high engagement, it's the highest driver of engagement, and with high engagement comes high profits. And so what I want to see in the world that I want to live in are, folks who, despite the fact that we haven't mastered this conversation around race, class, gender, identity, ability in the macro environment, when we do walk into the communities that we work with, work for, work in, that there's a willingness to say, we're going to try to model what it's like to be better so we can show the world it's possible to be better, right? And so that's the type of world that I want to live in. That's why I'm committed to this work. But I just think that anyone in this room can be a D&I practitioner so long as there's a willingness to cross that line and actually have that human connection, right, that says, I want to be there and stand with and stand for you. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to iterate on false promises of inclusion as certain demographics are able to, make millions while others are still left behind.
Thank you. You can just drop that mic right there.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't really follow that, so just everything you said. But one important point that was brought up here is that we can't put the onus on the underrepresented groups to do all the work. And so it's up to us to call in those who are in positions of privilege within the organization to join in doing the work. Because what oftentimes happens within the organizations is like, oh, okay, well, this ERG will figure it out, or this group will figure it out, on top of everything else they're already dealing with. And so we've had success with the neurodiversity ERG and engaging leadership to speak out about their personal experiences and start modeling that inclusive leadership behavior, naming and normalizing these conversations in the workplace. I love the name Normalize Navigate. I'm going to use that now. And just starting there and understanding that not everyone is going to come out in the workplace with their mental health, whatever they're dealing with. And that women, people of color, LGBTQ, all these other layers of identity means that those folks are disproportionately impacted by the stigma and by the challenges and have greater barriers to accessing care, accessing resources and support in the workplace and in their personal lives. And so being aware of that as the organization and not putting the work on the groups that need the most support.
Thank you. I want to do, one of our norms at Inclusion Ventures is to accept non-closure, which I'm really trying to practice. I want to invite us to do a rapid fire. What's one thing that you want everyone to be able to take back with them and implement at their workplace, potentially, or something that you're seeing as a best practice, and then we'll take a few questions and answers. So, for example, best practice for people can just request PTO. They don't have to say why. And make that a norm. And then to explore lenses. One of our clients shared with us that she grew up in a home where her dad is an alcoholic, and she's an executive assistant. So she approaches everything from her perspective as like trying to avoid any challenge so that things wouldn't get triggered. Even though her boss is not an alcoholic, there's kind of that father dynamic that's there. Once her team knew that, they just saw everything completely differently. So PTO, just plain, and explore lenses. Who would like to go next for a quick rapid fire request or invitation?
I really can't stress enough just having simple conversations. Just really lean into that. It's really difficult for people to open up without having some report or some history. And that's something that I encourage my team. I encourage all managers. Just talk to someone about something simple. How was your day? How was your weekend? And be genuine about it.
Thanks.
I would just utilize the existing structures that might exist around D&I within your organization and see how you can incorporate mental health into programs that already exist, trainings that already exist, and just build off of that. You don't always have to start and recreate the wheel. Just start seeing where you can start integrating and planting the seed.
Great.
I'll be super quick. I think that the thing that's going to change a lot of high-tech organizations and many of our organizations is creating a critical mass of inclusive leaders. I think that starts with bearing witness to people's experiences. Brian Stevenson says hope is an orientation of the spirit, the ability to position oneself in a hopeless place and bear witness. And so I've committed my life work to bearing witness to people's experiences because it liberates them, it liberates yourself, and it liberates others. And I hope that we can all walk away as a best practice. Something that we can each do is just to stand witness to people's experiences who are trying to find their own voice.
For those HR leaders, or anyone going back to your companies who want to start having conversations about mental health, is really having a game plan for, I guess, what comes next. Because a lot of times, a lot of leaders, they'll disclose even personal journeys, but then what? And I don't think people think about that, and so it might leave a lot of people hanging. And so just being thoughtful about really what's the whole plan.
Great, thank you. Rapid fire questions continue. Take a few quick questions and then go to lunch. So if you could raise your hand and keep it to a question, not a comment. We'll take a few questions at once, kind of how they did earlier. Yeah. Great. So self-disclosure, how to focus and include, and then dismantling norms of whiteness, white supremacy culture. Any thoughts?
I think about the self-disclosure, the way I've coached managers and the way I've done that led different teams is that I've been very strategic and realizing that in order for folks to open up with me, I need to open up myself. And I'll start with simple things, something that might have happened over the weekend, or just something that allows me to be safe but genuine about something that's really occurred in my life. And I just try to find the right opportunities to just disclose a little bit more about me. However personal I want to get with the other individual, after I've done a little bit of analysis of who they are and what might resonate with them. I know that's a little bit vague, and the reason it's vague is because it will vary depending on who I'm trying to connect with. But definitely leaning into disclosing more about myself has opened up other people so that they can open up about themselves.
Thanks. Others on any other topics?
Well, just a resource I would share in terms of the dismantling white supremacy. Showing Up for Racial Justice is an organization that calls in white people to educate themselves on privilege and start trying to do that work. And I did see that they have a resource on their website called Dismantling White Supremacy in the Workplace, and there's some guide you can download, and it has information so wanted to just share that if folks are interested in looking through that. And then the question about disability, and because the disability community is incredibly large and diverse, and there's so many segments within that community, and There's some areas where there's shared experience and some areas where it's like very distinct communities. And so it is a question when you're thinking about creating a resource group for employees, how broad or how narrow of focus to make it. And I think that's going to be on a case-by-case basis based on the work environment, the body of employees that you have. And I know at Verizon we have a disability employee resource group and a neurodiversity employee resource group, because we felt that within neurodiversity, there's so much within that that we wanted to have two separate, so that's what we're doing for now. Yeah.
You're not required. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, white supremacy, dismantling the structure itself. So one, I think we all can be in agreement that white supremacy as an ideology is flawed. It's fantasy. It doesn't exist, right? But it has very ontological effects, so very tangible effects that, determine and dictate folks' outcomes. The ideology itself has many tenets, but fundamentally at its core, it's that coexistence can't happen, right? Like allyship is just can't happen. And so I've always thought that some of the easiest ways to combat the ideology that miscegenation as a term or coexistence as a term can exist is to show that coexistence can exist, right, through allyship. Now, there are some harmful ways to be an ally, right? Some hard lessons that I've had to learn as this weird mix of being Black, Latino, gay, from the hood, still living in the hood, that I've had to kind of overcome to understand how I can be a better ally. But I would definitely say that coexistence and the way that people show up is a way to fracture that and dismantle it in the workplace. So everything from hiring, right? So having an ally who can say that this person is equally as capable as another. Promotions, not necessarily having to be a person of color, a woman, or some other identity in a room to say that something's wrong in that calibration session, like that person is equally capable. In firings, right, which is why is it that this person's character, you're talking about their character traits, about how they're behaving, rather than actually the work that they're doing. Coexistence and allyship goes a really long way, in my view, in dismantling that ideological structure. And I think we've seen moments where it's worked.
Good. Okay, great. I'm just so grateful to hear, and I know we're just kind of scratching the surface, and I hope that everyone's taking home at least one thing that they heard that applies, or a new thought, or a new way to think about things, or maybe someone wants to Google white supremacy culture. There's some really good resources out there of what it looks like perfectionism, or focus on writing. I'm like, oh shoot, I thought that was just, good to do, right? So there's some really important exploration around that. I'm happy to talk about it during lunch as well. Implore you or invite you during lunch to, instead of just asking how someone is or how the weather is, to talk about your lenses. This is a brave space to practice that, or talk about what's going on or what you're taking from the panels or other best practices that you're finding or wishing. Thank you so much to each of you as humans, the humanity that you brought to today that I'm assuming you bring to other interactions, not just to panels, and also for the really deep work that you do. And I know we focused a little bit more on the culture and the belonging piece and less so on the product, but how that also applies and navigates. So thank you for being you and for showing up today and always. Thank you all.